Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and a new video on creation and evolution. The Philosophy of Science by Karl Popper, Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1 yet, I can recommend you go and watch it first, but just in case, I will begin by briefly reviewing what we've seen last time. After that, I will introduce you to Falsificationism, which was at the heart of Karl Popper's philosophy of science, and his solution to the problem of induction. Next, we will see how Karl Popper dealt with pseudoscience and metaphysics, before we will have a long, in-depth exploration of how all of this is related to the theory of evolution. But first a summary. At the beginning of Part 1, we saw the origin of modern Western science when Europeans rejected Aristotle's theories and the mountains of commentaries they inspired from antiquity all throughout the Middle Ages. Then we saw a new generation of natural philosophers rise to the occasion, rejecting all but the most basic assumptions and constructing their view of reality virtually from the ground up. Starting with observations and experiments, they developed what might be called the first scientific method, or the method of induction. I mentioned people like Francis Bacon, Galileo Galilei, John Stuart Mill, and of course, Sir Isaac Newton. The basic idea was that you start without any theory or assumptions, and you just go out into nature or into your lab, start making observations, do experiments and gather data, and based on this, you form your theories. Then came David Hume, who poked some serious philosophical holes into this whole endeavor, challenging the idea that induction can give us certain knowledge. First, because though science talked a lot about causation, you cannot observe causation directly. And secondly, you cannot know that the observations and experiments you did today will give the same results tomorrow. And then I added a few more challenges and problems that were raised by later philosophers. However, in the 19th and early 20th century, these philosophical problems were politely ignored by most scientists, and instead the philosophy of positivism or logical positivism arose. Real science, or real knowledge, they said, had to be verified by empirical observations. Anything else is just metaphysical nonsense and should be ignored. At the same time, there was the rise of various types of pseudoscience. I mentioned astrology, Phrenology, Eugenics, Psychoanalysis, and Marxism. All of these claimed to be scientific, but a young Austrian philosopher of Jewish descent began to make waves. After being a pupil of the psychologist Alfred Adler and having a brief fling with Marxism, he began to seriously think about the problems he saw with the prevailing philosophy of science. Karl Popper saw three interconnected problems with the philosophy of science. They were: 1. The problem of induction was not solved, and often conveniently ignored. 2, or 2a, the demarcation criterion of verification allowed too many pseudosciences to masquerade as real science. 2b, the verification criterion also excluded too much, including itself, especially since only empirical verification counted as science. 3. The theory of induction, he observed, did not accurately describe what scientists were actually doing in the field, the lab, or the library. Let's have a closer look at the third problem, as I think it was Popper's observations of scientists at work that inspired his solution to the other problems. The method of induction, as I explained in my first video, and as was worked out in the theory of logical positivism, basically sets out the following 4-step model for scientific progress. Step 1. First, you gather a boatload of data. Either in the field or in the lab, it doesn't matter. Step 2. After you've gathered your data, you sort and organize the data. Francis Bacon talked a lot about tables, but any helpful system will do. Step 3. you carefully look at the results and formulate a hypothesis. Step 4. After formulating your hypothesis, you repeat the experiment a couple more times, or gather some more data in the field. And if your hypothesis includes a statement on causation, you can think of clever experiments to exclude all other possible causes, like how, for example, John Stuart Mill had his 4 ways to prove causation. And after these 4 steps, you are done. Now, in the previous video, several challenges were already leveled against various of these steps, as well as to the process as a whole. But let me here only mention the additional challenges that Popper himself emphasized. Let's begin with steps 1 and 2. Popper noticed that scientists do not, no, they cannot go and gather data without a framework for understanding what they are looking for. No scientist goes into their lab and begins to haphazardly mix random chemicals together. Aside from it being potentially dangerous, if there is no method, you may get a lot of data, but it will be virtually useless. Nor do scientists go out into the field and gather random data. It may feel like that sometimes, especially if we think back to the age of sail when scientists would accompany ships sailing all over the world, but even there was at least some order. They would sample things, seemingly at random, but it wasn't random. They would find an insect they have never seen before, so they capture it and bring it back. But why pick this insect? Well, because it looked interesting, of course. Yes, but how do you know it is interesting? Why not gather a jar of air? Or a jar of beach sand? Or some river pebbles? Because they are not interesting, you say? So then, even in these kinds of environments, where it seems wide-eyed scientists had free rein to gather samples of everything they wanted to, they were still bound by an already established concept or framework of what is and isn't interesting. You might say that this is common sense, but that's exactly Popper's point. Because when we went to the moon, what did the astronauts bring back? Yes, moon rocks. And what are those Mars rovers collecting and analyzing? Just the most benign and omnipresent scoops of sand. Because for Africa or South America or Polynesia, different rules apply as to what is or isn't interesting, compared to the moon or Mars. Why? Well, because we already have a theoretical framework for which rocks are and are not interesting and worthy of detailed scientific study. Popper one day dramatically illustrated this when he was giving a lecture to some students. He said, "Take pencil and paper, carefully observe, and write down what you have observed." The students happily took pencil and paper, and then paused. What are we supposed to observe? Was the question. And that is exactly the problem, isn't it? Observe the professor, observe the room, observe the lights in the ceiling, the person next to you, the pencil in your hand. What? We cannot possibly write down everything we observe. We need to focus on something. Prioritize some things over other things. And we also need a time frame within which we observe. We also need to limit our senses. Should we include what we observe by hearing or not? We need to limit our descriptions. Let's say we observe the professor. Do we describe his hair? How? What adjectives do we use? What should or shouldn't we measure about his hair? We have to answer all of those questions. There is no avoiding it. But answering these questions can only be done after you have a theory or a framework of understanding, not by induction or observation itself. You may begin with observing, but very, very quickly you have to make a choice about what is worth your attention and what isn't. And this choice will in large part be determined by the questions that arise out of the theory you already had before you began your observations. And this previously established framework will also have an enormous influence on how you organize your data. Let's say you gathered a bunch of rocks. How do you organize them? By size, from big to small, or by shape, spherical to oblong? Surface, smooth to rough? consistency, hard or crumbling, location where it was found, how much you can sell it for on the open market, color, taste, the sound it makes when you smash it with a hammer? The answer is, that depends on what kind of question you are trying to answer. Compare this quote from Popper in his book Realism and the Aim of Science. Observations are always collected, ordered, deciphered, weighed in the light of our theories. Partly, for this reason, our observations tend to support our theories. Next, Popper noticed a problem with step 3, where you examine and organize data and form your hypothesis based upon it. In the previous video, I had already noted the issue that data can potentially be interpreted in 2 or more ways, but there is more. Popper observed that scientists didn't just let the hypothesis naturally be distilled from raw data. No, in fact there was always a leap in logic between the gathered observations and the results of experiments on the one hand, and the hypothesis or theory that was formulated on the other hand. A creative insight, a bold idea, an imaginative approach. That, he believed, made a real scientist. One example a later commentator on Popper's theory gives is that of Charles Darwin. Darwin himself claimed that he developed his theory of evolution by means of natural selection by simply gathering a lot of data and then letting the evidence speak for itself. And to be sure, he was responsible for an impressive feat of data gathering, both when he was on board the HMS Beagle and afterwards when he was back at home in England. But that is not all he did. He was a creative genius who was constantly thinking, conjecturing, imagining, postulating, hypothesizing and theorizing in an enormously creative manner. This creative aspect of his theory forming, or sciencing, was indispensable in making him a great scientist. Now, if you are a scientist watching this, you may be surprised to hear this. Perhaps you're even slightly insulted. You may object by saying that you did just follow the evidence. But I would say that you're actually selling yourself short. You are underestimating your own creativity. You are not simply gathering data and drawing obvious conclusions. You are doing something far more impressive and much more difficult. You are creatively interpreting. So, those were Popper's criticisms of steps 1, 2 and 3. Did he also have objections to the 4th step here, where, with additional experiments and observations, you try to verify your hypothesis? Why, yes. In fact, his objections to step 4 were the most important and are a key to unlocking his understanding of what real science is. Here it helps to use an example. Albert Einstein. In the previous video, we saw that Einstein had predicted that starlight would bend around the sun, and Dyson and Eddington went down to Brazil to ultimately prove Einstein right. We now look back at this over 100 years later, and we kind of forget what it must have been like for Einstein and the scientific community. For it wasn't just as simple as I described. Einstein's prediction, though intriguing and well supported by all sorts of observations and calculations, wasn't just like any other old prediction. It was wild, huge, spectacular, bold, and dangerous. And I don't mean that anyone was in danger of physical harm, but Einstein risked everything. If he was proven right, if starlight did indeed bend around the sun, then he would become the greatest scientist alive, nay, the greatest scientist since Sir Isaac Newton. But if he was wrong, he would have been forgotten. He probably would have been able to continue working as a lowly college professor somewhere in Germany, and in this alternative reality we would obviously hope and pray that he would have found his way to America in a timely manner as well. But his career as a world-class scientist would have been over. Nothing more than a footnote in history. Popper applauded Einstein, both for his creativity in coming up with general relativity, and for his bold prediction. And though he wouldn't demand that scientists risk their entire careers with every scientific theory they develop, he did demand that every scientific theory would be structured the same way as Einstein's. Namely, you develop a theory by whatever creative process you want, and then you make a bold prediction. Not bold in how much you risk or bold in how much it differs from the currently accepted models, but bold in the sense that the experiment could prove you wrong. A good or proper scientific experiment, Popper argued, starts with a hypothesis. It doesn't matter how you get to the hypothesis, whether you used a lot of data or a little bit of data, or how you and where and when it was gathered or brought to your attention. Steps 1 and 2. Nor does it matter if your hypothesis was formed rather quickly or intuitively, or whether it took a lot of creative thought. Step 3. These things are irrelevant. All that matters is what kind of experiments you can devise to test it. A good experiment should have at least 2 possible outcomes, with at least 2 possible consequences. The experiment can result in A, an affirmation of your prediction, thus verifying your hypothesis. Or it can have result B, or more precisely, not A refutation of your prediction, thus falsifying your hypothesis. Of course, sometimes an experiment can come back with something completely unexpected, like if the starlight would have bent twice as much as Einstein had predicted, or if it bent in the opposite direction, but let's keep things simple for now. And this was Popper's new demarcation criterion: falsifiability. Previously, I mentioned that the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle had set up a demarcation criterion for what is and isn't real science, namely verificationism. A theory is scientific if you can set up an experiment or gather empirical data to verify your theory. Popper turns the tables and says that real science instead sets up experiments or looks for data to falsify the theory. Let me illustrate this by adjusting probably the most famous example in the philosophy of science: black swans. Let's say you are a biologist and you have seen a lot of swans, and all the swans you have seen so far were white. So by the theory of induction, you can now formulate your theory. All swans are white. And every time you see another white swan, you verify your theory. But unless you have seen literally all swans and confirmed that they are all white, you can never definitively prove your theory. On the other hand, once you see a single black swan, your theory is definitively disproven. This leads to a very important conclusion for Popper. Science can never definitively prove a theory. At best, it can definitively disprove a theory. Yes, of course, for practical reasons, and for practical reasons alone, one may at some point assume a theory to be true and then use it in technology, or as an assumption for developing a new theory built upon the previous one. But you can never be 100% sure. This method of falsificationism, he believed, would excise all or at least most pseudoscience. At the same time, Popper was opposed to the verificationism of the Vienna Circle, as he believed it hindered rather than helped science. This was because, by demanding that every statement be empirically verifiable, a lot of rational ideas were excluded, even though rationality is necessary for good science. Or as Michael Heller put it, rationality from outside the empirical realm is a necessary condition for the rationality of the empirical method itself. By doing so, Popper allowed for a lot of helpful disciplines like math, formal logic, and even metaphysical assumptions and research programs to become part of the scientific process. Wait, what? What was that about metaphysics? Metaphysics? Okay, let's slowly unpack this one step at a time. Now, let's first see how this new demarcation deals with pseudoscience and why it has been such a powerful tool for exposing it for what it is. In the previous video, we looked at astrology, phrenology, eugenics, Marxism and psychoanalysis. Let's tackle each of those in turn. When discussing astrology, I already mentioned that the predictions that astrology makes are so broad and vague that almost any person over any period of time will encounter the results of an astrological prediction. I suggested that if you take someone who believes in astrology and let them read this week's predictions at the end rather than the beginning of the week, they would always be able to find some evidence that the prediction was correct. Popper would reverse the logic. It may be easy, almost inevitable, to find verifying evidence. How would you find any hypothetical falsifying evidence? What sort of week could possibly have occurred for the prediction to be proven false? None. And there you have it. Whatever astrology is, it isn't science. Here it is in Popper's own words, from his book Conjectures and Refutations. Astrologers have always claimed that their science was based upon a great wealth of inductive material. This claim is perhaps unfounded, but I have never heard of any attempt to discredit astrology by a critical examination of its alleged inductive material. Next, Phrenology, the pseudoscience that dealt with skull shapes and that tried to prove that white people were superior due to the shape of their brains. So what is wrong here? Well, a lot, of course, but putting aside the racism, one major philosophical problem is that phrenology blurred the line between the true or false question and the how question. Let me explain what I mean. It would be a valid, if somewhat dubious, scientific question to ask if there are measurable differences between different human races or ethnicities when it comes to the shape of our skulls. It is at least potentially a valid, though extremely dubious, scientific question to ask if certain human races are more creative, or more obedient, or more intelligent than others. But phrenology wasn't asking these true or false questions. It was asking the how questions. It assumed that there were measurable differences between the races, both in skull shapes, which could be measured directly, and our mental processes, which were assumed to correspond directly to those skull shape measurements. All that phrenology was doing was answering the how questions, taking the true or false questions for granted. This, in turn, led to a situation where any skull measurement, regardless of what it was, helped to fill in the how questions. And no skull measurement could ever be used, even hypothetically, to re-evaluate the true or false questions. Now it is true that phrenology had gone out of fashion some time before Popper, in part due to the growing inconsistencies between the various how answers. So the scientific method, as it was practiced, was eventually able to weed out this pseudoscience. However, if scientists had applied Popper's method and some critical thinking, phrenology might have been exposed as pseudoscientific a lot sooner. A similar but more complex picture arises when it comes to eugenics. Though sadly, it was primarily the immoral consequences of eugenics that were most effective in pruning this branch of science rather than an application of Popper's philosophy or internal contradictions. Though here too, several fundamental assumptions were ignored, and how questions dominated over true or false questions. However, when I wanted to delve deeper into the question of whether and how eugenics was pseudoscientific or falsifiable, I noticed that apparently the debate about this is alive and well among scientists and ethicists, in part because of a series of redefinitions of what eugenics is and what it is supposed to do, and in part because it is now fully married to our understanding of genetics, a branch of science unknown to early eugenicists. So let me just say that classical eugenics was an extremely underdeveloped branch of science and heavily relied upon unscientific or pseudoscientific assumptions and methods, and much of it was unfalsifiable. Next, let's have a look at Marxism, Freudianism, and Adlerianism. Though, let me note in advance, if you personally look more favorably upon any of these theories, or find them helpful in psychology or sociology, the following is not intended as a criticism of these theories. It is an illustration of how Popper used his falsification criterion to criticize the idea that these theories were the result of inductive reasoning alone. For some more details, see the previous video, but here is a long quote from Popper himself from his book Realism and the Aim of Science, where he is pondering the problem of demarcation. I became suspicious of various psychological and political theories which claimed the status of empirical sciences, especially Freud's psychoanalysis, Adler's individual psychology, and Marx's material interpretation of history. All these theories were argued in an uncritical manner, it appeared to me. A great number of arguments were marshaled in their support, but criticism and counter-arguments were regarded as hostile, as symptoms of a willful refusal to admit the manifest truth, and they were therefore met with hostility rather than with arguments. What I found so striking about these theories, and so dangerous, was the claim that they were verified or confirmed by an incessant stream of observational evidence. And indeed, once your eyes were opened, you could see verifying instances everywhere. A Marxist could not look at a newspaper without finding verifying evidence of the class struggle on every page. And a psychoanalyst, whether Freudian or Adlerian, assuredly would tell you that he finds his theories daily, even hourly verified by his clinical observations. But were these theories testable? Were these analyses really better tested than, say, the frequently verified horoscopes of the astrologers? What conceivable event could falsify them in the eyes of their adherers? Was not every conceivable event a verification? It was precisely this fact, that they always fitted, that they were always verified, which impressed their adherents. It began to dawn on me that this apparent strength was in fact a weakness, and that all these verifications were too cheap to count as arguments. Popper illustrates this by spending the next chapter criticizing Freud's methodology in his book The Interpretation of Dreams. Dreams, Freud argued in his book, were mere wish fulfillments. Okay, but what about nightmares or anxiety dreams? Freud addresses this question in his book. But according to Karl Popper, Freud is waffling and coming up with all sorts of unsatisfactory non-answers before landing on the so-called conclusion that nightmares and anxiety dreams are also a form of wish fulfillment. For you see, anxiety is the result of unfulfilled sexual urges, and that can lead to neurosis and anxiety, including anxiety dreams. Right. Or here, another example which Popper uses to critique both Freud and Adler. A man pushes a child into the water with the intention of drowning it. And another sacrifices his life in an attempt to save the child. Each of these radically different cases of behavior can be explained with ease. According to Freud, the first man suffers from repression, say, of some component of his Oedipus complex, while the second man had achieved sublimation. According to Adler, the first man suffered from feelings of inferiority, producing perhaps the need to prove to himself that he dared to commit a crime, and so did the second man, whose need was to prove to himself that he dared to risk his life. I cannot think of any conceivable instance of human behavior which might not be interpreted in terms of either theory, and which might not be claimed by either theory as a verification. And Marx doesn't escape unscathed either. In this passage from Conjectures and Refutations, he criticizes Marx and others misusing the philosophy of Hegel. They use Hegel's philosophy mainly for the purposes of apologetics, to defend the Marxist system against criticism. Thanks to dialectic, which is Hegel's philosophy, the anti-dogmatic attitude has disappeared, and Marxism has established itself as a dogmatism, which is elastic enough by using its dialectic method to evade any further attack. It has become what I have called a reinforced dogmatism. In another book, The Myth of the Framework, he accuses Marxists, Freudians, and Adlerians of living in a closed framework. Closed in the sense that they are completely immune from criticism. Worse, it could be defended by attacking the one criticizing it. It was during the great and heated discussions after the First World War that I found out how difficult it was to get anywhere with people living in a closed framework. I mean people like the Marxists, the Freudians and the Adlerians. None of them could ever be shaken in his adopted view of the world. Every argument against their framework was interpreted by them so as to fit into it. And if it turned out to be difficult, then it was always possible to psychoanalyze or socioanalyze the arguer. Criticism of Marxian ideas was due to class prejudice. Criticism of Freudian ideas was due to repression, and criticism of Adlerian ideas was due to the urge to prove your superiority, an urge which was due to an attempt to compensate for a feeling of inferiority. Are you beginning to see the problem? Now, take note that though Popper is critical of Freudianism, Adlerianism and Marxism, his point isn't so much to attack these theories or their adherents. He merely wants to use them as illustrations for what he considers the wrong approach. For even later in his life, when falsificationism became much more popular among scientists, these three theories in psychology and sociology continued to be discussed in the context of their confirmation or verification, not in the form he wanted, potential falsification. In short, by using falsification, the possibility to prove a theory wrong, rather than verification, the possibility to find corroborating empirical evidence, Popper wants to distinguish between real science and pseudoscience, instead of between empirical science and metaphysical theories. In fact, he had no problem in principle with metaphysical statements or metaphysical theories, or even what he would call metaphysical research programs, as long as they were open to some form of analysis or criticism. Metaphysics in science? As I previously said, Popper was open to the idea of metaphysics playing a part in science. See for example this quote from Realism and the Aim of Science. As far as science and metaphysics are concerned, I certainly do not believe in anything like a sharp demarcation. Science has at all times been profoundly influenced by metaphysical ideas. Certain metaphysical ideas and problems have dominated the development of science for centuries as regulative ideas. Or a few pages later, I do not believe that metaphysics is nonsense, and I do not think it possible to eliminate all metaphysical elements from science. They are too closely interwoven with the rest. He goes on to clarify that if a metaphysical claim or statement is detected in a scientific theory, and it can be eliminated or replaced with a scientific, that is a testable element, then we should do so. Or, conversely, if there is a good scientific theory, it shouldn't be replaced by metaphysics if it can be avoided. But why does he believe it is impossible to eliminate all of it from science? Even better, what does Karl Popper think counts as a metaphysical theory? One of his favorite examples is atomism. Ancient or classical atomism, as developed by Leucippus and Democritus, was metaphysical in nature. Atoms were too small to be detected, and the void between the atoms even more so. Yet, this ancient atomism was proven to be correct, but only after the theory underwent certain changes. First, scientists had to say how small exactly an atom was, and second, they had to devise tests and instruments to measure these, up until that point, hypothetical atoms. So here a metaphysical research program, based on the initially untestable hypothesis that everything is made up of atoms and the void, eventually transformed into a real science, once technology developed to the point where it became testable. Another example of a metaphysical research program is the philosophical theory developed by Hobbes, Descartes and Boyle, that the whole universe could be explained in terms of matter and motion. This, too, eventually changed from a philosophical idea, via a metaphysical research program, into a real, testable scientific theory. These theories were useful even before they became proper science, because these metaphysical theories served as a research program for science. It indicated the direction of our search, and the kind of explanations that might satisfy us. These metaphysical research programs can become science only once they become testable, that is, empirically falsifiable. But even before they become falsifiable, and thus science proper, they can be discussed rationally. That is, good metaphysical theories can be rationally criticized. See for example this quote: "Although empirically irrefutable, that is, not falsifiable, these metaphysical research programs are open to discussion. They can be changed in the light of our hopes they inspire or of the disappointments for which they may be held responsible." So to summarize, metaphysics and metaphysical research programs can be extremely helpful for progress in science. Research programs, in particular, have often been stepping stones in the history of science. Ideally, they will either transform into a testable theory or be replaced by one. But even if that's impossible, they can still point science in a helpful direction. Or, as James Ladyman put it, Popper did not think that unfalsifiable metaphysical theories ought to be rejected altogether, for he recognized that sometimes scientists might be inspired to make interesting bold conjectures by beliefs that are themselves unscientific. For example, many scientists have been influenced by their belief in God, or by their belief in the simplicity of the laws of physics. But clearly, neither the proposition that God exists, or that the fundamental structure of the world is simple, is falsifiable by experience. Finally, a good metaphysical research program should still be critically analyzed, and, if possible, be compared with other metaphysical research programs to see which one is more useful for science. Alright, so this was a very brief and condensed summary of Popper's philosophy of science. Specifically his demarcation criterion of falsification and how he applied it to distinguish real science from pseudoscience, and the role that metaphysical research programs play in science. For more information you can read his Logic of Scientific Discovery, English translation 1959, Conjectures and Refutations 1963, Realism and the Aim of Science 1983, and a variety of other books and articles by and about him. But I hope that we are now at least sufficiently informed to ask the big and scary question: is evolution falsifiable? If so, how precisely? And if not, then what is it? Let's first see what Karl Popper has said about evolution, before I will give my own thoughts on the matter. Though he has written some brief remarks on evolution in his 1957 work The Poverty of Historicism, and had mentioned Darwinism, as he called it, in a couple of lectures in the 1960s and early 1970s, I want to start the discussion in 1974, when a 2-volume work was published that was called The Philosophy of Karl Popper. It contained a series of critical essays of Karl Popper's philosophy and Popper's responses to those essays. However, the first volume opens with what it calls an intellectual autobiography. Later, in 1992, it appeared in a slightly updated version as a separate work with the title Unending Quest. Here Karl Popper doesn't just describe his life up until that point, but also describes how his ideas were formed over the years, who his influences were, and what his thought processes were. Here he writes explicitly and quite elaborately about what he thinks about the theory of evolution. On page 133 we reach a subsection called Darwinism as a Metaphysical Research Program, and on the next page we find the following sentence, often quote-mined by creationists. I have come to the conclusion that Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program, a possible framework for testable scientific theories. Before exploring this further, let me make the following observations. 1. This quote should not be used to prop up Popper as some kind of anti-evolutionist, as some creationists make him out to be, for the opening line of this whole section reads as follows. I have always been extremely interested in the theory of evolution, and very ready to accept it as a fact. 2. This quote is often given in isolation without explaining what Karl Popper means by Metaphysical Research Program, but I hope that my previous discussion has shown that this can in no way mean that Popper thought of evolution as an equal to religion. 3. Though I will first explore his position in 1974 more closely, we will later see that he also changed his mind on this topic, so stay tuned. Back to 1974 and evolution as a metaphysical research program. Why would Popper say such a thing? Well, in short, he believed that the theory of evolution is too vague or broad to make specific predictions, and that it therefore doesn't really explain anything. He gives the hypothetical example of finding life on Mars, but instead of finding the wide variety of life as we do on Earth, we only find 3 or perhaps just 1 life form. Wouldn't evolution predict that there is more variety? Well, no, evolution predicts that when there are certain favorable circumstances, variety can occur. But evolution itself does not predict what those favorable circumstances are, nor does it say that variety must occur, and hence it is not falsifiable. Additionally, speaking of adaptation, Popper argued, is tautological, or a form of logical necessity, as opposed to empirically testable. At first sight, natural selection appears to explain adaptation, and in a way it does, but hardly in a scientific way. To say that a species now living is adapted to its environment is, in fact, almost tautological. Indeed, we use the term adaptation and selection in such a way that we can say that if a species were not adapted, it would have been eliminated by natural selection. Similarly, if a species has been eliminated, it must have been ill-adapted to the conditions. Adaptation or fitness is defined by modern evolutionists as survival value and can be measured by actual success in survival. There is hardly any possibility of testing a theory as feeble as this. Or as Michael Heller summarized, on the one hand, evolutions say that the fittest organism will survive. On the other hand, fitness is defined only as ability to survive. So then, it doesn't matter which organisms survive and which die, as nothing will disprove adaptation or the notion that the fittest will survive and reproduce. Additionally, he argued, evolution cannot predict how or when adaptation occurs. Mutations are random, and so is evolution. For example, and this is my example, the climate gets colder. We might expect that species adapt, but how would they do that? They might get a mutation that allows a mammal to grow thicker fur. Or their metabolism would change such that they now bulk up in the summer and hibernate during the winter. Perhaps they change their behavior and live closer together. Perhaps they grow larger to decrease their surface to volume ratio. Perhaps their teeth and claws grow bigger, such that they can now hunt for bigger prey or defend themselves better. All of these are possible, according to evolution, but in Popper's words, we cannot predict any particular evolutionary change. Now, this opinion of his was not appreciated by everyone, and critics responded to his characterization of the theory of evolution. One such critic was Michael Ruse, who wrote an article that appeared in 1977. Right from the abstract, it is clear that Michael Ruse has an axe to grind with Karl Popper. Popper can draw his conclusions only because he is abysmally ignorant of the current status of biological thought, and Popper's criticisms of biology are without force. One criticism he levels against Popper is by taking a closer look at his hypothetical example of finding life on Mars. Ruse argues that evolution does make potential falsifiable claims about variety. Evolution predicts that variety will come about when and only when there is some advantage to or cause for such variety. Ruse then goes on to talk about hypothetical planets that would more naturally allow for more or less speciation, and the kinds of predictions that evolution would make about variety. ending one discussion of what would happen if a hypothetical planet were to have way more or way less variation among its life forms than evolution would predict. Then, modern evolutionists would be worried. Later in his article, Ruse talks about two more driving forces of evolution and speciation, namely the founder effect and genetic drift. Both are essentially a form of chance or luck that also play a role in evolution. For the biologists, please forgive my brevity here. I may make a video about these topics in the future, but the long and short of it is that Popper, prior to this article, did not talk about those topics, and almost exclusively talks about evolution as being the same as natural selection. Next, Ruse brings up the notion of reproduction, and that evolution depends on a certain level of fecundity. Evolution only works if a species reproduces with sufficient quantity and a certain amount of variation. If we all butted off one and only one offspring asexually, evolutionary theory would be false. And let me add here that there should also be a certain amount of heredity, because if beneficial traits cannot be passed on mostly reliably, then evolution would also be falsified. He adds a few more points to this, but let's just mention one more, namely that of the idea that evolution could be falsified if deteriorating mutations were to spread among a population. The example he gives for this goes as follows. Suppose one found on an island a group of men who had lost their sight. Once again, evolutionists would have to rethink their theory. In short, Ruse's objections to Popper's 1974 remarks are twofold. The first is that Popper doesn't really understand evolution and only looks at natural selection. He ignores various other forces at work in evolution. Secondly, there are several ways in which evolution could be falsified, because it does make predictions about life and adaptation. Hypothetical planets, problems with reproduction and heredity, and hypothetical damaging mutations that successfully spread throughout a population could all potentially falsify evolution. In response to Ruse and other critics, as well as after reading more about evolution, Popper decided to retract his characterization of evolution in a 1977 lecture at the Darwin College in Cambridge, later published as a paper called Natural Selection and the Emergence of Mind. After some opening remarks, he repeats his earlier statement that he used to believe that Darwinism was tautological, or almost tautological. A tautology is a statement that is self-evidently true and therefore both unfalsifiable and useless in trying to explain something. Like, any triangle has three sides. It's true because it is true, and it doesn't explain why a triangle has three sides, nor why a closed shape made of three straight lines is a triangle. It just is. Popper freely admits that he had understood natural selection in that way. Natural selection is that nature selects those who are naturally most selectable, or the fittest survive because they are most fit to survive. But he then goes on. I still believe that natural selection works in this way, as a research program. Nevertheless, I have changed my mind about the testability and the logical status of the theory of natural selection, and I am glad to have the opportunity to make a recantation. My recantation may, I hope, contribute a little to the understanding of the status of natural selection. He next begins to talk about other forces at work in the theory of evolution beside natural selection, like genetic drift and sexual selection. That is the isolation of a small group from the main group by random chance, and selection based on sexual preferences unrelated to survival, like the peacock's tail. These other forces serve as examples of where natural selection alone is insufficient for explaining all diversity and all, as Popper calls it, seemingly designed features of living organisms. This way, he claims, natural selection can explain some things, perhaps even most things we observe in biology, but not all. Therefore, to claim that natural selection is responsible for any particular example becomes testable or falsifiable, since other explanations are also possible. However, as later scholars have noted, this so-called recantation doesn't really amount to much. For one, most biologists now see sexual selection as a special form of natural selection, and so that alternative falls away. As for Popper's comments on genetic drift, he fails to provide an example of how genetic drift can bring about those seemingly designed features we observe in organisms. So in short, in this paper he achieves something that is rather trivial. He simply constructs a statement about natural selection that is testable and, let us grant, false. So what I think is going on here in this debate is a multi-layered disagreement that is a little bit tricky to untangle. If I simplify the debate and try to understand what's going on, I come to the following conclusions. 1. Popper thought that the theory of evolution consisted of various parts that all needed to work together for evolution to work, as biologists believe it does. 2. One key component of the theory of evolution is natural selection. Without natural selection, the theory of evolution is incomplete and cannot explain all that it wants to explain. 3. Natural selection is unfalsifiable. 4. Therefore, though most parts of the theory of evolution are falsifiable, the theory as a whole is not falsifiable. 5. Since the theory as a whole is not falsifiable, it is either pseudoscience or a metaphysical research program. Popper opts for the latter, primarily because it has proven extremely useful in helping science to make progress to better understand our world. For those who want to delve into this question further, I've put some articles in the description that discuss Popper's view on evolution and its empirical testability or falsifiability in much more detail. But let me end the discussion of Popper and his critics here and offer up some of my own thoughts on evolution and whether or not it is falsifiable. And let me warn you up front, this discussion is going to be both complex and contentious. So pay close attention and try to follow my argument carefully. After which you may still disagree, even strongly disagree. But my aim isn't to make you agree with me. My aim is to force you to think for yourself and develop your own ideas and opinions. And sometimes the best way to do that is to carefully examine the opinion of someone you disagree with. Let me start with making the following remarks. First, I will approach this topic as a critic. Any theory has to prove it is falsifiable, as in, the burden of proof lies with the theory of evolution. Therefore, I will assume it is not falsifiable unless and until I find a hypothetical experiment or a series of experiments or a hypothetical finding that would falsify the theory of evolution. Second, I will approach this topic like a skeptic. In the literature that I've read, as well as in interactions I've had with biologists and other people happily defending evolution, I have come across many proposed ways in which the theory of evolution could be falsified. However, I won't just take anyone's word for it. I will very critically examine whether the suggested falsification would actually falsify evolution or not. Third, for practical reasons, I will group a lot of arguments together and examine what I think is the strongest of the bunch as a case study, or mix the examples together and discuss them in an abstract form. Fourth, again for practical reasons, I will divide arguments in two main categories. A. Arguments that deal with proof that evolution is occurring, like natural selection, genetic drift, mutations, etc. And B. Arguments that deal with proof that evolution actually happened in the past on this planet and is responsible for the diversity of life here, like the ability to construct a phylogenetic tree in the form of a nested hierarchy, the fossil record, etc. Now, let's do an experiment, specifically focused on whether or not evolution works or not. Let's take a group of organisms that belong to the same species and let's put them in an environment. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this environment and this species are both stable, there are no changes in the environment and no changes in the frequencies of alleles. Biology tells us that evolution can occur in a stable environment and in a changing environment, but it is generally understood that it is more likely in a changing environment. So let's change the environment slowly. Let's say we make it colder. A few degrees every year. What are all the possible things that can happen to our species? The way I see it, there are only 4 possible options. 1. It can change. 2. It can die. 3. It can move. 4. It cannot change. Option 1 can come in a variety of ways, including a change in behavior, but let's say we only count genetic changes. Well, maybe the frequency of certain alleles changes over time. Or maybe even a beneficial mutation occurs, which then spreads and makes our species better adjusted to the cold. Great! Evolution verified! 2 is of course very sad. However, does this falsify evolution? No, it may just mean that they were unlucky. Evolution, after all, works with probabilities. Maybe they didn't have any alleles present in their population that benefited them more in the cold. And maybe they were unlucky that no other beneficial mutations occurred. But that doesn't disprove evolution. Option 3 also doesn't falsify evolution. Option 4 also doesn't falsify evolution. One might theorize that we should make it even colder, or perhaps this species has already adapted to the cold in the past. Regardless, it would not falsify evolution. Now one might say that with bacteria or fruit flies, many experiments have already been done. And though sometimes options 1, 2 and 4 occur, bacteria and fruit flies tend not to escape the lab, option 1 occurs almost every time. In fact, we can predict the probability of a particular bacteria becoming antibiotic resistant quite accurately, and the same for fruit flies becoming tolerant to alcohol. In fact, I myself have done some lab experiments with fruit flies and alcohol, and indeed they did adapt. But here I would still raise my philosophical finger and ask the question, though we can predict the probability of adaptation in the lab, we can only predict this for particular species under specific conditions. Not because the theory of evolution gives us a specific number, but because we have done this many times. Evolution only predicts the principle, but not the particular of adaptation. How well will a specific species of ants respond to climate change? Well, we can take that particular species of ants and put it in a lab and study it under various conditions. But that won't tell us anything about how well other species will or will not adapt. So I think that up to this point I can agree with Popper. The theory of evolution predicts that species may adapt, and experiments can tell us specifically how likely it is that it will happen under certain circumstances to a certain species. A theory about what will happen in a particular experiment on a particular species under particular conditions can be falsifiable. Aspects of this can be broadened to apply to certain kinds of species under certain kinds of conditions, which can be adjusted with more experiments and observations. But falsification of the theory as a whole remains challenging. Verification of it occurs all the time, but falsification, I'm not so sure. For if we, after many experiments with various types of ants, come to a general theory of how ants will adjust to climate change, and then we go out into the field and we find that these ants adapt very differently or perhaps not at all, then our specific model of how ants should evolve is falsified, but not our theory of evolution as a whole. And something similar happens when we look at mutations. Take antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Evolution predicts that a bacteria may become resistant to antibiotics. This happens all the time, and it verifies evolution. But if a bacteria does not become resistant via a mutation, that doesn't falsify evolution. How likely is it that a particular bacteria becomes resistant to a particular antibiotic in a particular situation? Well, we can calculate that. but we cannot predict exactly when the first bacteria becomes resistant. Additionally, there are many mutations that can make a bacteria resistant, but which of those particular mutations will occur is impossible to predict. To emphasize this point, let me quote David Stamus, who argued this very unpredictability of mutations. There are no laws of mutation. Current evidence strongly indicates that there are basically 3 different mechanisms responsible for spontaneous point mutations alone: tautomeric shifts, proton tunneling, and aqueous thermal motion, each of them based in quantum indeterminism. Now, I've asked around for some other examples of experiments that would falsify evolution, and I got a bunch of examples. In the category of arguments related to whether or not evolution is possible or not, it seems the examples of experiments and observations came down to this. Evolution is only possible with a certain degree of heritability, a certain degree of variation, and a certain degree of selection pressure. This, I think, looks promising, for the argument goes something like this. Between the extremes of too much heredity and too much variety, evolution can only occur within a particular band in between those. Likely more towards heredity than variety, but it cannot be too much, because if there is too much heredity, then everyone would reproduce perfect copies of itself with no variation in alleles and no mutations. In such a scenario, evolution could not occur. Nor could evolution, or any kind of adaptation, occur if offspring were completely arbitrary, because then beneficial traits could not be passed on. I call this promising, but not because it works here. Let me explain. If a species does not adapt to a changing environment, and it turns out after analyzing the species in question that they didn't evolve because of either too much heredity or too much variation and randomness, combined with selection pressure that was either too subtle to have an impact or too great, causing them to die out too quickly, that wouldn't falsify evolution. It would just mean that this species, which has happily evolved for the past however long it's been, suddenly lost its ability to evolve any further. Either due to bad luck or because something in the DNA stopped working properly, but it wouldn't falsify evolution. Even if all species on this planet, from now on, would go to one extreme or the other and evolution would stop, that would only mean that evolution would stop working for the affected species. It would not mean that evolution as a theoretical model of life would suddenly stop existing, as in, it would not falsify evolution. Let me give an analogy. Biologists tell us that evolution only works if and when certain parameters of heritability and variability are present. If they are absent, evolution is impossible. That is not dissimilar to saying that gravity only works when you have a space-time continuum that is filled with objects that have mass. If you do not have a space-time continuum, or you don't have objects that have mass, then the effects of gravity would not be observed. But that would not falsify the theory of gravity. It would merely not be applicable here. And let's turn it around as well. If we observe evolution, and on the heritability-variability scale, the species in which it is observed is, say, here, then we would conclude that evolution can occur when a species is there. It is not the other way around. Starting with only the theory of evolution, you cannot predict with absolute certainty whether or not evolution would function if we knew that a species would be here, or here, or here on the heritability-variability scale. In short, it shows underlying necessary conditions. It does not provide a potential falsification. Yet I did call it promising because it may be useful in the second category, evidence that evolution has occurred in the past. But before I dig deeper into the issue I just mentioned, let me mention 2 examples of possible falsification of evolution that I've often heard that also fall under this category. The first one is a pretty famous one, and it involves Precambrian rabbits. At some point in the future, I hope to do an introduction to the geologic column. But suffice to say that, according to the standard geological models, the Precambrian rocks were formed between roughly 4.5 billion and 540 million years ago, while rabbits are believed to have evolved around 40 million years ago. The argument goes that if we find a fossilized rabbit in Precambrian rocks, that would prove that rabbits were around at least 500 million years earlier than is currently believed, and this would falsify evolution. But not so fast. If we look at the structure of the example, this is in essence a rather extreme case of finding a fossil in the wrong place. This is, however, nothing strange for paleontologists. They constantly find fossils in places or in layers they didn't expect them. A species turned out to be around much earlier than expected. Another species, thought extinct after a certain time, is suddenly found in much younger layers, or in some cases, even alive today. This doesn't mean that evolution is now falsified, just that the particular time we thought a particular species had evolved now has to be adjusted. And these kinds of adjustments happen constantly, based on new paleontological finds. And this is great. This is good science. You have a theory of when a species evolved, you find something that contradicts it, and now you adjust your theory to match the facts. Now, a Precambrian rabbit would be extreme, but not a death knell for evolution. Or as Elgin and Sober put it, the discovery of a rabbit in the Precambrian would require an important reworking of when various taxa first appeared and how different taxa are genealogically related. But neither of these changes shows that the theory of evolution is false. Now, you might disagree with me, I'm pretty sure several of you will, but the point is that finding a species in a layer that is 2 million years older than expected, and finding a species in a layer that is 500 million years older than expected, is in essence only a difference of degrees. So if you think that a Precambrian rabbit fossil would falsify evolution, the question becomes, when is a fossil too far out of place? And why is that an intrinsic hard line in evolution? What I think is going on here is that there is a subtle blurring of the line between the true or false question and the how question. Or in this case, perhaps the when question. Or between the question, has evolution happened in the past and is it responsible for the diversity of life? And the question, how and when has evolution played out exactly in the past to get us to where we are today? Or to use a metaphor, there is a difference between did John travel from Los Angeles to New York and when, by what route and with what mode of transportation did John travel from Los Angeles to New York. I believe we should do our best to separate these two out as much as possible. CCTV footage of John in Japan on a particular day will certainly falsify several theories of when and how he traveled, but not by definition that he traveled. Another argument regarding the falsifiability of evolution has to do with a concept known as consilience. But in order to do it justice, I have to run you through a bit of high-level background information and present to you what I think is the strongest case for evolution that I am familiar with. So buckle up and pay close attention. In my video on taxonomy, I briefly pointed out that systematicians were able to construct a nested hierarchy of species, such that their ordering represented their evolutionary relationship in a tree-like structure. The discipline is called cladistics or phylogeny. The argument in favor of evolution goes something like this. Not only can we recognize in nature a nested hierarchy, which could be an argument in favor of evolution in itself, but we can also use different independent lines of research to come to the same conclusions. Or to put it differently, if we look at morphology, the way a species looks, we get one phylogenetic tree. If we look at cell structure, we get a very similar tree. If we look at genetics, we get, again, a very similar tree. And if we look at molecular biology, we once more get a similar tree. And if we then match that with the rate at which species change, which is very slowly, we can estimate when species evolved and diverged, which in turn matches perfectly with the fossil record. This is what you will often read in introductions to evolution, and they are indeed able to present a pretty strong case for evolution this way. However, in this video, we are not interested in the question whether evolution is true or not, nor whether this argument is as strong as it appears in introductory textbooks. We are interested in how this strong case for evolution could be used as a method for its hypothetical falsification. For the argument then continues like this. Evolution could be falsified if these different phylogenetic trees would not match with each other or with a fossil record. All you have to do to falsify evolution is demonstrate that one of these independent lines of evidence leads to an evolutionary history that is incompatible with one of the other ones. And this is where we can tie in our previous discussion on the degree of heritability and variability, especially when it comes to genetics. Because once, with all these different lines of evidence, we have both a timeline, how many generations ago two species shared a common ancestor, and a quantifiable amount of change that needs to occur in that time frame, we can match that with how much change we actually observe in these or similar species today. Wait, I'm probably going too fast here. Let's slow down a little. On the one hand, our studies in heredity and variation in various environments has given us a very rough estimate on how much heredity and how much variety there is from generation to generation. Or to put it differently, we are beginning to understand the rate at which mutations show up and the pace at which the beneficial mutations can spread in a population, especially if and when nature selects rather rigorously. Now, we may not know this about all species and all possible mutations in all circumstances, so by definition this is a very, very rough estimate, but still we have a baseline for what that range would look like. On the other hand, based on paleontology, genetics, molecular biology and morphology, evolutionary biologists have constructed a phylogenetic tree of life. In this tree of life, one can map out, roughly, when two species last shared a common ancestor. So let's say we have species A and species B, and based on the available evidence, they split off from their common ancestor between, say, 10 and 12 million years ago. Next, we have to look at how similar and different they are, especially in their DNA, and make an estimate of how many changes, on average, would have to occur per generation, and then see if that matches with our estimates of how much variety and heredity we observe in these and similar species today in a variety of circumstances. Does that make sense? However, I have some practical and philosophical questions about this last proposed falsification method as well. First of all, and I already hinted at this, but the phylogenetic tree keeps changing. For example, when new, surprising fossils are found. Additionally, the phylogenetic trees that are constructed with these different techniques all lead to quite different results of what that tree should look like. Yes, there are some rough similarities, and especially the branches that are farther out show more consilience, to use that fancy word again, but the closer one gets to the origin of life, or the farther back in time one goes, the different lines of research are conflicting more and more with each other. This is not surprising or problematic per se. There are good, sound, logical reasons as to why this is becoming more and more difficult, so I wouldn't use this lack of harmony to casually claim that evolution isn't true. See, for example, a very technical paper in the Bibliography by James Bucknan and his colleagues. But it does raise the question of how much disagreement between these different lines of evidence would be sufficient to falsify the theory. Is there a clear, hard number? If they differ by more than 5%? What if they differ by 10%? 15%? And how do you even calculate that? And then we add in the question of heredity versus variability again. which initially looked so promising as a potential falsifier, but all of a sudden the whole thing becomes much less clear, since it comes at the tail end of a long, complicated and ever-shifting reconstruction. Not to mention, we can only accurately measure heritability and variability in living species, not in extinct ones. In fact, the best and perhaps the only way we can estimate where now extinct species fall on the heritability variability scale is by using a harmonized phylogenetic tree which prescribes where this species must have been in order for all the other available evidence to make sense. Now please don't misunderstand me. There are lots of hardworking biologists right in the middle of all this research, balancing out all the different issues I raised and many more which I haven't raised, and I have a lot of respect for them. The primary focus of their work is making sense of the data, and then, tentatively, make predictions about how and when and where evolution explains all the available data. Predictions and hypotheses, it must be added, that are almost always formulated in a Popperian way, as in, generally, they can be falsified. But the issue is that for me, it seems, falsifying evolution as a whole, via this line of reasoning, seems much less simple or obvious than it at first appeared. So even if there is a way to falsify evolution using this line of reasoning, it is way more complicated and nuanced than a simple experiment or observation. Additionally, and this makes everything even more complicated, these independent lines of research are perhaps not as independent as one might think. Biologists working in one field are usually aware of what biologists working in another field are doing, and when their particular research comes up with an estimate, they will always try to correlate it with the estimates from other fields. Peer-reviewed papers will be sent back unpublished if, say, a geneticist concludes something that contradicts paleontology without further analysis. The geneticist will first have to discuss the paleontological research in detail and make a serious attempt at harmonizing the two approaches. Do please note, this is good science, taking all available evidence into account, but it also is a process that is primarily focused on avoiding falsification rather than finding a falsification, especially falsification of the theory as a whole. To summarize, do I think evolution is falsifiable? I am not convinced that evolution is falsifiable when talking about whether or not evolution is an ongoing process. On the one hand, it is too much of a mathematical and statistical inevitability, and on the other hand, as long as several parameters are in place like life existing, a balance between heritability and variability, and a certain degree of selection pressures, evolution will happen. And if it suddenly stops happening, biologists will tell us that it is because the parameters within which evolution occurs are not present, not because evolution is wrong. As for falsifying the theory that evolution is responsible for all the diversity of life, I think it is theoretically possible, but not via a single, unexpected observation or a single outcome of an experiment. Derived theories of how and when evolution occurred in a particular instance can be falsified and are frequently falsified, but the theory as a whole cannot be falsified in that way. It is only theoretically falsifiable by looking at all parts at the same time. There is no silver bullet that could, even hypothetically, falsify evolution as a whole, which means that it is likely only falsifiable if a very large group of scientists from a wide variety of biological and biology-related disciplines get together and systematically work through the Consilience of Phylogenies argument for evolution. Though, even then, I suspect, enthusiastic defenders of evolution would almost certainly be able to wiggle their way out via a number of theoretical loopholes and escape hatches. Now at this point I was going to look at a few more ways in which people have suggested that evolution could be falsified, followed by a brief discussion about whether or not creationism could be falsified, which is also a more interesting and nuanced question than it at first appears, Then I was going to question the validity or falsifiability as a whole by discussing the works of Pierre Duhem and Willem van Ornam-Quine, before giving a brief teaser for a future video I was going to do on Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science. But I'm afraid I've basically reached the end of how long I want the videos in this series to be. So I'll have to put all that in Karl Popper Part 3, to be produced at some point in the distant future. For my next video in this series, we'll leave the philosophy of science behind and look at Charles Darwin's book The Voyage of the Beagle, his autobiographical account of his trip around the world in the 1830s that ultimately inspired him to work out his theory of evolution. And as always, you may leave your comments, questions, suggestions and criticisms below this video.